Question 66. Bentham's view on calculation of pleasure and the types of pleasure. Introduction. Jeremy Bentham, an English philosopher and founder of classical utilitarianism, sought to create a scientific and rational system of ethics based on a single moral principle, the principle of utility. According to Bentham, the ultimate goal of all human actions is to achieve pleasure and avoid pain, and the moral worth of any action is determined by its consequences, specifically the amount of pleasure or pain it produces. To measure this pleasure, Bentham introduced a calculus of felicity or hedonistic calculus, a method by which the quantity of pleasure and pain resulting from an action could be systematically calculated. His theory also distinguishes between different types of pleasures, though he primarily viewed them as quantitative, not qualitatively different. 1. The principle of utility, the basis of Bentham's ethics. Bentham defined the principle of utility as follows: that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever according to the tendency it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in the question. In simple terms, an action is good if it produces more pleasure than pain, and an action is bad if it produces more pain than pleasure. The moral aim of life, therefore, is the greatest happiness of the greatest number. 2. Pleasure and pain as the two masters. Bentham believed that human beings are governed by two sovereign masters, pleasure and pain. Every decision or action we take is an attempt to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. He viewed pleasure as intrinsically good and pain as intrinsically evil. Therefore, the moral worth of an act depends on the balance between the pleasure and the pain it generates. For example, if telling the truth in a situation causes minor pain but promotes long-term trust and happiness, it is morally right because the total pleasure outweighs the pain. Third, the hedonistic calculus, felicific calculus. Bentham proposed that pleasures and pains could be scientifically measured and compared. He identified 7 criteria or dimensions through which the quantity of pleasure and pain can be evaluated. These are: 1. Intensity, that is, how strong is the pleasure or pain. A more intense pleasure is preferable to a weaker one. For example, the joy of achieving a lifelong goal gives a stronger pleasure than eating a piece of cake. Second is the duration. How long does the pleasure last? Pleasure that endure longer are more valuable. For example, the satisfaction of education lasts longer than the momentary thrill of gambling. Third, certainty or uncertainty. However, how likely is it that the pleasure will actually occur? Actions with a higher probability of resulting in pleasure are preferable. For example, investing in health through exercise gives certain long-term pleasure, whereas gambling gives uncertain pleasure. Propinquity or remoteness. How soon will the pleasure occur? Immediate pleasures may be more attractive, but delayed pleasures with greater value may be more rational. For example, the pleasure of studying now, which is the delayed reward, may be less immediate than watching a movie, but its future payoff is higher. Fusidity. How likely is a pleasure to produce further pleasures? Pleasures that lead to more happiness are preferable. For example, helping others not only brings immediate satisfaction but also creates lasting goodwill and friendship. Sixth, purity. How free is the pleasure from accompanying pain. Pleasures unaccompanied by pain are purer and more valuable. Example: reading an inspiring book is a pure pleasure. Overeating, though pleasurable, leads to discomfort. Seventh, extent. How many people are affected by the pleasure or pain? The greater the number of people benefiting, the better the action. Example: a public health campaign benefits society more than a private luxury purchase. Fourth, the process of calculating pleasure. Bentham believed that moral and political decisions could be made scientifically by applying these 7 criteria. Thus, the net utility, that is total happiness of an action, equals to the sum of all pleasures minus the sum of all pains, taking into account their intensity, duration, certainty, fusionity, purity and extent. Suppose a government plans to build a new public park. Pleasures would include public enjoyment, health benefits, aesthetic value. Pain would include tax burden, displacement of a few vendors, etc. If the total pleasure, greater happiness to thousands, outweighs the total pain, minor inconveniences to a few, then according to the calculus, the action is morally justified. Fifth, types of pleasures according to Bentham. Bentham categorized pleasures into 2 broad groups, simple and complex, and further identified their sources. He believed that all pleasures are quantitatively comparable, differing only in degree, not in kind. First, physical pleasures. Pleasures arising from bodily sensations or sense experience. Example: eating, resting, exercising, or enjoying nature. Second, pleasures of wealth or possession, derived from ownership or material gain. Example: earning money, buying a house, or increasing savings. Third, pleasures of skill, derived from mastering an art, craft, or activity. Example: the satisfaction of learning to play the piano or painting a picture. Fourth, pleasures of friendship or social affection, arising from social relationships, love, or companionship. Example: spending time with family or helping a friend in need. Fifth, pleasures of power, associated with influence, control, or recognition. Example: being elected to office or leading a team successfully. Sixth, pleasures of benevolence or sympathy, derived from helping others and promoting general welfare. Example: donating to charity, volunteering, or supporting the poor. Seventh, pleasures of knowledge or curiosity, intellectual satisfaction from learning or discovering truth. For example, solving a complex problem or reading a thought-provoking book. Eighth, pleasures of religion, derived from spiritual fulfillment or faith. Example: meditation, prayer, or participation in religious rituals. Thus, Bentham saw all pleasures, physical, social, or intellectual, as measurable by same quantitative scale. Sixth, no hierarchy of pleasures. Unlike John Stuart Mill, distinguished between higher and lower pleasures, Bentham argued that all pleasures are equal in kind, differing only in intensity and duration. He wrote, "Prejudice apart, the game of push-pin is of equal value with the arts and sciences of music and poetry." This means that if a simple physical pleasures like playing a game produces as much happiness as a refined intellectual activity like reading poetry, both are equally moral. For Bentham, quantity of happiness, not quality, determines moral worth. For example, if dancing brings a person more happiness than studying philosophy, then dancing is more valuable for that individual. Seventh, application of calculus in moral and legal contexts. Bentham used the hedonistic calculus as a rational guide for lawmaking and governance. He argued that laws and policies should be evaluated based on their utility, that is, how much pleasure or happiness they produce for the community. For example, a law punishing theft is justified because it reduces fear, that is the pain, and promotes social security, that is pleasure. Another example, a welfare policy is like providing free education. A welfare policy like providing free education increases public happiness by enabling self-improvement, outweighing the cost of taxation. Thus, Bentham's approach made ethics, politics, and law part of the same scientific pursuit, that is, maximizing collective happiness. 8th, criticisms of Bentham's calculus. First, it is mechanical and quantitative. Critics argue that happiness cannot be measured numerically like money or weight. Second, neglect of quality. By treating all pleasures equally, Bentham ignored moral and intellectual dimensions of happiness. Third, individual differences. People differ in temperament and values. What brings pleasure to one may cause pain to another. Fourth, impractical for decision making. In real life, it is impossible to calculate the intensity, duration, and extent of every pleasure and pain. Despite these criticisms, Bentham's calculus laid the foundational framework for utilitarian ethics and modern cost-benefit analysis in public policy. 9th, practical relevance. Bentham's method remains influential in modern policy making, economics, and legal systems. The cost-benefit analysis used by governments and corporations today reflects Bentham's logic, that is, assessing the total social benefit versus total cost of a decision. For example, environmental policies that balance industrial growth with pollution control embody utilitarian reasoning. Bentham believed that human action is guided by the pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain. To evaluate moral actions, he introduced the hedonistic calculus, which measures pleasure by its intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, purity, and extent. He identified several types of pleasures: physical, social, intellectual, and moral, but regarded them all as quantitative comparable. His approach made ethics rational, empirical, and socially oriented, though criticized for being too mechanical and simplistic. The principle is based on the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Pleasure and pain are the two sovereign masters of human life. Hedonistic calculus includes 7 factors: intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, purity, and extent. The types of pleasure include physical, social, intellectual, power, sympathy, religion. The view is that all pleasures are equal in kind and differ only in quantity. Purpose is to create laws and actions maximizing total happiness. Criticisms include mechanical, ignores quality, and individuality. Let's look at one-line question answers. First, who introduced the hedonistic calculus? Jeremy Bentham introduced hedonistic calculus. Second, what does the calculus measure? It measures the quantity of pleasure and pain produced by an action. Third, name the 7 factors of Bentham's calculus. The 7 factors are intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, purity, and extent. Fourth, what is Bentham's moral principle called? It is called the principle of utility. Fifth, what are the 2 sovereign masters according to Bentham? The 2 sovereign masters are pleasure and pain. Sixth, how did Bentham view pleasures? Bentham viewed pleasure as quantitatively, not qualitatively different. Seventh, what is an example of fecundity of pleasure? The example would include a kind act leading to long-term goodwill and friendship. 8th, what is an example of purity of pleasure? Example would include reading or learning without negative after effects. 9th, what is the ultimate moral goal? The moral goal is the greatest happiness of the greatest number. 10th, what modern method reflects Bentham's calculus? It is the cost-benefit analysis in policy-making decisions. Bentham's calculus of pleasure and his utilitarian ethics represent the first major attempt to make morality rational, measurable, and socially relevant. By linking ethics with human happiness, he laid the groundwork for modern democratic, legal, and economic systems that measure success not by power or faith but by the well-being of the people. In Bentham's own words, it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong.